This paper is only 2 months old, titled Ancient DNA from the Green Sahara Reveals Ancestral North African Lineage, and this is the first time this distinct people group has been identified. What we could call a NA people group that is so ancient that it's likely from the main out of Africa group that spread all over the world. These people spread up into North Africa, and surprisingly did not mix with other groups. We'll see that it's only a 7% admixture from another group. I'll get to who that group is in a sec. So 93% of the genome has stayed the same since the original out of Africa push. And so one of the big takeaways of this story is that there is a 100% cultural change, going from foraging to working with domesticated animals. And that can happen without major genetic changes. Foreign technology without being overwhelmed by a foreign people group. Kind of like what happened with the story of the red-headed mummies in China. So we'll break down this important new paper, add some context to flesh out parts since it was written for those with already a deep understanding of the subject. This isn't a pop-sci article, but published in Nature on April 2nd, 2025. So let's get into it, starting by understanding where we're talking about. The Sahara Desert as we know it today, just endless sand dunes devoid of life. It was not always this barren. Around 14,500 to 5,000 years ago, there was what was called the Green Sahara, a lush savanna with lakes, rivers, and grasslands. This wet era, known as the African Humid Period, transformed the deserts into habitable lands where plants, animals, and people thrived. Early humans hunted, fished, and later herded livestock in this fertile landscape. They left behind cave paintings of cattle and wildlife, stone tools, and even human burials. Then, around 5,000 years ago, the climate shifted again. Rainfall dwindled, the lakes dried up, and the Sahara reverted to the arid desert we see today. When it was lush and vibrant, people found this area, and of course they found it very easy to live in. Some scholars long suspected that when the Sahara was green, it might have acted as a corridor for ancient migration, and facilitated the movement of people and cultures all across Africa. And it was reasoned that this would mean that North African and sub-Saharan populations mixed freely during this time, exchanging genes and ideas. In the video I made on how the concept of a genetic Eden, or one special spot in Africa that gave birth to Homo sapiens, has been replaced with a view that showed a more constant coming and going of admixture from populations all over Africa. I mentioned how the oldest Homo sapien fossil remains are in Jebel Arud in Morocco, and so we have modern humans for around 300,000 years. And just in case you're wondering if this newly identified people branch just developed in North Africa since modern humans had been there for so long, it is believed to be a migrating group out of East Africa with that main OOA explosion that everyone else around the world descends from. Because the researchers successfully sequenced mitochondrial DNA from one of the Takarkori women, and found that it belonged to a deep branch of haplogroup N, a lineage that descends from mitochondrial Eve through L3. The branch that left Africa and gave rise to Eurasian lineages. And so they still seem to be part of this group that branched out, confirming their connection to the broader human family tree. And while some people get tripped up on the fact that there was so much admixture, in a way, yes, everyone across the world is part of one big shared family group, but we can still identify the first people groups, like the ancestors of the San people down in South Africa, up to these genetic and archaeological records that also show distinct peoples and cultures in North Africa. Like in the northwest, modern Morocco, a culture called the Ibero-Marusan produced unique stone tools and buried their dead in caves like Tafaralt around 15,000 years ago. In the central Sahara and modern Libya, rock shelters like Takarkori hold remains of people who practiced early pastoralism around 7,000 years ago. And until recently, scientists could only guess at how these groups are related to each other and how they related to other ancient peoples. At Takarkori rock shelter in southwestern Libya, archaeologists found layers of occupation ranging from hunter-gatherers who fished and hunted around 10,000 years ago to pastoralist herders living between around 8,300 and 4,600 years ago. The site even yielded natural mummies, human bodies that were dried and preserved by the desert conditions. And these discoveries told us that a community thrived at Takarkori for millennia, transitioning from foraging to herding cattle. And rock art in this region depicts cattle and daily life scenes, suggesting a development of pastoral culture. Though major questions remained, did these people come from elsewhere, or were they an established local population? Some earlier theories proposed that as the desert greened, groups from sub-Saharan Africa might have moved north, or people from the Near East, where farming of domesticated strands of grains and cattle began, they might have moved west into the Sahara. Could the spread of herding and domesticated animals into the Sahara have been driven by incoming migrants, new groups of people moving in, or did indigenous hunter-gatherers adopt these practices on their own through cultural diffusion? The big breakthrough came when scientists managed to extract and analyze ancient DNA from human remains in the Sahara. The full set of DNA, or genomes, of these two Saharan women were compared with the DNA data from many other human populations, both ancient and modern. By doing this, they can identify genetic similarities and differences that tell the story of ancestry. Think about all the biblical translations out there. If you got enough of the passages, a lot of the words in any passage might be the same, but if you get enough, you'll be able to tell which translation or edition it came from. If two individuals share many unique DNA markers, they likely belong to the same lineage or had common ancestors. If their DNA is very different, their populations may have been separated for a long time. One challenge in analyzing ancient DNA is distinguishing meaningful signals from background noise. Over thousands of years, random mutations accumulate in isolated populations, a process called genetic drift. In small or isolated groups, certain gene versions can become more common or disappear just by luck, by randomness, not necessarily because they were beneficial or harmful. And this makes ancient, isolated groups genetically unique. The scientists have to account for genetic drift when interpreting how closely related or distant ancient people are from others. They also look for evidence of interbreeding, a gene flow between populations. If DNA from one group shows up in another, it suggests migration or at least some contact in the past. When the researchers analyzed the DNA of these two women from Takarkori, the results showed that most of their ancestry came from a previously unknown lineage, essentially a lost branch of the human family tree that had been in North Africa for a very long time. The genetic data show that this North African lineage split off from other human groups around 50,000 years ago. And that's about the same time that modern humans were expanding out of Africa and into Europe and Asia. It appears that while some humans left the continent, others stayed in Africa but became separated. The ancestors of the Takarkori people seem to have been among those who stayed in North Africa and remained isolated from other African groups for tens of thousands of years. What this study stresses is that their DNA shows almost no trace of sub-Saharan African ancestry. Sub-Saharan Africa refers to the region south of the Sahara, places like East, West, and Central Africa, basically everything but North Africa. And these findings suggest that even during the Green Sahara period, when one might expect north-south travel to be easy, these North African inhabitants did not mix much with other groups from further south. As senior researcher Johannes Kraus noted, despite the Sahara's transformation into a lush, habitable landscape, gene flow between sub-Saharan and North African groups remained minimal. In other words, the Saharan populations and sub-Saharan populations stayed genetically distant, going against the assumption that the African humid period led to free mixing across the continent. And if you look at the diversity of populations across Central, East, and West Africa, many of them also stayed isolated from each other. It's not like even sub-Saharans are one big people group. They are a very diverse group of a ton of different people groups. So this North African lineage is just another one that also stayed isolated. I know I'm just showing a lot of highlighted sections of this paper, but this one I want to read word for word. We next explored the direct genetic affinity between Takarkori and the OOA ancestry found in all non-African modern humans, in contrast to African groups. Zlati Kun, a 45,000-year-old Upper Paleolithic individual from Czechia, was used as a proxy for OOA ancestry, as it is probably the oldest modern human sequence to date, and represents the deepest known human lineage after the OOA lineage splits from the African lineages. So in other words, it's the best genome sequence we have to compare to of someone that was out of Africa. Our results showed positive values for Takarkori, indicating that it is genetically closer to Zlati Kun than to sub-Saharan Africans, including Moda, a 4,500-year-old genome from East Africa. So while these samples are from 7,000 years ago, which is far closer to Moda at 4,500, they're actually closer to this person found in Central Europe. So I know I repeat myself a lot on this point throughout this video, but I really don't think it can be stressed enough that just because it is in Africa, it does not mean that it's more closely related to other African groups. The Takarkori and Moda person are both in Africa, and they're only separated by 2,500 years. But nonetheless, these people in the Sahara are more closely related to someone found in the Czech Republic in Central Europe who was 45,000 years old. And you can't have it both ways. This is one of the core points of Out of Africa, that all Out of Africa groups are actually more similar than other groups in Africa. Not only were the Takarkori individuals distinct from sub-Saharan Africans, they also showed a close genetic connection to another ancient people, 15,000-year-old hunter-gatherers from Takarkori Cave in Morocco. These remains are of the Ibero-Mauritian culture and are from the end of the Ice Age, well before the Green Sahara's peak. Finding a link between the 15,000-year-old Takarkori foragers and the 7,000-year-old Libyan herders meant that a single lineage spanned North Africa for at least 8,000 years. This was one widespread people group all over North Africa. This is incredible continuity. It suggests that through dramatic climate changes, from the Ice Age to the Green Sahara to the desert, a core population in North Africa persisted. They adapted culturally, shifting from hunting to herding, but remained genetically connected to their Ice Age ancestors. Again, this is like the ancestral North Eurasians, the ANE people comparison, in that they were so widespread at one point, but with genetic drift and mixing, they became other distinct groups, to the point that finding near 100% ANE mummies was so shocking. So this near 100% NE people group at Takarkori in Libya is even more impressive since the Takarkori people far to the west in Morocco are heavily mixed with the Natufians, which people mostly think of as being in the Levant. But the article says, quote, Takarkori ancestry is composed of a 60% contribution from a Natufian-like Levantine population, while the remaining 40% derived from a Takarkori-like ancestral North African population. So you may have seen it in a ton of comments on my own videos, and on just the internet in general, that because of the Green Sahara, it was likely Central African people that were all throughout this region. This couldn't be further from the truth. You'd actually be 60% right to say that on the furthest northwestern side of Africa, these were actually Natufians, and that 40% is this unique people, identified for the very first time in this paper, who likely migrated with the original out-of-Africa groups. They just never actually left the continent. So Africa was full of Homo sapiens at least around 300,000 years ago. The first distinct people groups we can identify are the South African hunter-gatherer groups around 200 to 100,000 years ago. Then around 60,000 years ago, the OOA group migration spread up and out. So if you want to be annoying, you can say that of course they have sub-Saharan ancestry in one sense, but so do Japanese and Scandinavians and everyone else on the earth. And the biggest oversimplification that I see is that just because they are in Africa, and even with a Green Sahara that theoretically made it easier for people groups to migrate, there is no proof here that they actually did. This new study shows that that NA group was distinct, and in a way that isn't as shocking as people might think, as so many other groups all throughout Africa have also stayed isolated for so long. Over thousands of years, being isolated in North Africa meant that this group developed unique genetic characteristics. Through genetic drift and limited outside contact, they became a distinct branch of humanity. These researchers describe it as a, quote, deeply rooted and long isolated genetic lineage, and this ancient lineage does not exist in pure form today, just like with ANE. Over time it mixed with other lineages, but it does survive as a significant component in modern North African populations. In other words, people living in places like Morocco, Algeria, Libya, and Egypt still carry a considerable portion of their genes from these ancient Saharan people. And the study also offered a peek into an even older story, our interactions with other human species. It turns out that the Takarkori individuals had a little bit of Neanderthal DNA in their genomes, more than what is found in sub-Saharan Africans today, but much less than people outside Africa. Neanderthals are our ancient human relatives that mainly lived in Europe and Western Asia, and modern humans outside Africa inherited Neanderthal genes through interbreeding over 50,000 years ago. The Saharan ancient DNA shows 10 times less Neanderthal DNA than what is found in people from Europe or the Middle East. And so how did it get there at all? The most likely explanation is that there was some limited gene flow from groups that had left Africa and come back. Perhaps a small number of people from Eurasia who had Neanderthal ancestry entered North Africa and contributed a bit to the local gene pool. The key point is, even those few traces of Neanderthal DNA confirm that North African populations were largely isolated, though no one is saying it is exactly 100% cut off. They had slight connections with outside groups, yet remained very distinct. And possibly the limited interactions they had with other people groups were those Eurasian groups coming down through the Levant, but far less interaction with other groups in Africa. And the paper doesn't mention this, but some food for thought. Let me know if you've heard any connections to this and put it down in the comments. But it is well accepted that far older Homo groups like Erectus had to have some sort of boat to get to islands like Flores and Oceania, and seafaring Neanderthals around 100,000 years ago is mainstream accepted, island hopping in the Mediterranean, so I don't know why this couldn't be a possible source of admixture, why there couldn't be some Neanderthal groups that were holding out in North Africa. Far less significant of a population than in Eurasia, but that might be why there's 10 times less admixture. Let me know what you think in the comments. But one of the most fascinating conclusions of this research involves how culture spread in ancient times. Specifically, the study addresses how pastoralism, the practice of herding domesticated animals, spread into the Sahara. Archaeological evidence showed that by around 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, people in the central Sahara were raising cattle and other livestock. The big question was, did the idea and skills for herding come with foreign people moving in, like the farmers and herders migrating from the Near East, where agriculture began, something that is not speculation but proven by the DNA strands of things like barley and wheat and the cattle themselves? There is a difference between these wild grains and wild aurochs. So did it come with them, or did the local hunter-gatherers adopt these practices through contact and learning? The DNA results give us a clear answer. There is no genetic sign of a large influx of Near Eastern or Levantine people in these 7,000-year-old Saharan herders. The women's genomes are overwhelmingly of a local North African lineage, with at most only tiny traces of Levantine ancestry. Not like that large 60% admixture we saw in Morocco. This means that the technologies of herding and animal domestication likely spread through cultural diffusion. This finding overturns earlier assumptions. It appears that local communities in North Africa learned about herding from their neighbors, or just through gradual contacts along trade routes, instead of being displaced or genetically replaced by invading outside farmers. Savino de Lernia, an archaeologist involved in the study, explained that the evidence, quote, points to a model where existing North African populations adopted livestock management through contact with neighboring groups. It's that the idea of keeping cattle could travel from one community to another like a cultural trend. You really do just have to have somebody see it being done, and then you can copy this idea. Again, it's very similar to what we saw with the Tarim Basin mummies. In that case, the red hair and other features normally associated with Europeans was compounded by a lot of tech and culture also from Europeans, like plaid clothing and heavy milk diets. But when we finally got their genome, it showed that it was ancient North Eurasian, which would eventually branch out east and west. So they had traits of European groups because they were the ancestors of some European groups. Modern redheads in Ireland and these mummies might have some shared ancestors, but it was not like redheaded Irish people went east into China. It's that the far older A&E people went both east and west. While staying nearly 100% A&E for so long, but also picking up a ton of cultural elements from neighboring groups like Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and Central Asia, as well as over from Eastern China. Again, while still being a distinct genetic group. Cultural diffusion without genetic diffusion. Very similar case here with this unique North African lineage. And the DNA is of course the best and most objective, but it is reinforced by some earlier findings, like the archaeological remains that show domesticated animals in North African sites not long after they appeared in the Near East, which always did suggest a link. But the tools and pottery styles in North Africa remained distinctively local. We can tell them apart too, implying that they may have originally been inspired by the Near East, but it wasn't like they were getting their tools from the Near East. They do develop them in their own unique styles. Just like how even if you prove that the idea of language came from some other group and was then practiced by this second group, it doesn't mean that those slightly later people never wrote anything original, even if the original idea of writing was foreign. We often see tech and culture picked up by a people and then developed in their own unique ways. There are a lot of similarities between Mesopotamian and Egyptian cultures. That's what I stress in the Bull Cult and pyramid building culture video, but of course they are both exceptionally unique. And discovery of this ancient North African lineage and its story has big implications for our overall understanding of history. It stresses Africa's genetic diversity and complexity. Africa is often discussed in terms of sub-Saharan, like Black Africans, and North African, often Middle Eastern or European admixture peoples. But this study shows that North Africa had its own native population with deep roots, neither recently arrived from somewhere else, not invading Arabs, nor offshoots of sub-Saharan Africans. The Sahara, even when green, didn't imply that people groups were constantly mixing to the point that there was no distinction between them. And this is obvious when you think about modern populations like Turkey, which is still mostly the same genetics as people 10,000 years ago. Despite being conquered by the Turks and having a culture that is tied to a religion birthed in Arabia, they aren't Arabs or Turks. Their genes show that they are overwhelmingly still just Anatolian, even with all these other cultural changes. There was constant contact between Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, later Persia and Greece, and yet somehow they did not become one big people group where we cannot tell them apart on either a phenotype level or a genetic level. Obviously, we all still branch from the out of Africa groups, and yet still did become unique people groups, being mostly homogeneous even as ideas spread all over the world. These findings also change how we think about the movement of people. It stresses something that a lot of people do not appreciate. It isn't always the case that big cultural changes, like the shift to farming or using metal tools, came with hordes of newcomers. Sometimes this definitely did happen. Think with the Mongols, or the best example is the genes related to the Yamnaya invading Europe, changing everything from phenotypes, how the Europeans look with lighter skin, to things like lactose tolerance. And that's a really impactful example, but it seems that more often, local people adopted innovations from neighbors. This research is also really exciting just on a technological and methodological level. Recovering usable DNA from 7,000-year-old remains in a desert environment is a huge scientific feat. It opens the door to more studies in the regions that were previously considered too challenging for DNA analysis. And so it's likely that we'll find more lost lineages in Africa and elsewhere as techniques improve and more samples are analyzed. So remember, just because people can travel from one region to another does not prove that they did. And also, if you see tech from one place and another place, it doesn't mean that these are all the same people. It could be anything from the complete Yamnaya conquest of Europe to the 60% Natufian admixture in Northwest Africa, to the ANE people of the Tarim Basin, or this NA lineage in the Sahara, which stayed near 100% genetically isolated. So I wanted to save my pushback for the end of the video here. To sum up my point, I can take a far more recent example with the Turks taking over Constantinople. The modern name of this country is Turkey because of these people. This was an invasion of a foreign people that brought a whole different type of culture and religion. Everything from food, clothing, architecture, the philosophy and religion of these people was influenced by these Islamic Turkic invaders. So much of the culture of Turkey was from foreigners. And yet most important to the comparison with the Takarkori people is that the people of modern Turkey only have about 10% admixture from Turkic people. You could picture 7,000 years from now, someone doing a report on this area and using the same logic of this paper could argue that because the people in this area are still 90% Anatolian, they match with Anatolian mummies from 15,000 years ago, showing this continuous Anatolian people in this region. This didn't mean that the people of this region just naturally picked up Islam and other cultural traits. It was imposed on them from an invading army. 7% admixture from this Natufian-like source sounds like a lot to me. When you put that in the greater context of the entirety of North Africa, continuing into the Levant, Turkey, and into Middle East area, the general consensus and this paper agree that the technology of domestication and all that came from the Levant, and they're saying you get 60% Natufian all the way over in Morocco, and it's acting like 7% isn't that big. And so of course I agree it doesn't mean that you have to have a complete genetic wipeout in order to have a new culture take over, but that was always a really rare case. It's far more common that an invading minority is able to take over another culture. I mean, you got the Turks taking over Turkey, and they brought this huge cultural change with Islam. This is true for the Romans throughout Europe. I looked up some stats that it might be as much as 40, but could be as little as 10% of Anglo-Saxon DNA actually changed the British Isles. And yet Anglo-Saxon culture became dominant there because of Anglo-Saxon invaders. There's even some places like the Orkney Islanders who have 25% Norwegian, this admixture from Viking invasions, and yet you have a complete reshaping of their culture. It's all Norse. So from Norse to Anglo-Saxon to Roman, modern-day Turkey, and so I actually think there's more historical precedent for a smaller minority of invaders who are able to completely reshape the culture of the people that they conquered. And 7% kind of seems like a lot, especially when it's up to 60% not that far away. And it's not a random 7%, it's the exact same people we think are connected to those who developed the tech that becomes so central to their culture in the first place. So let me know what you think about that, and if I'm missing anything. I don't really want to interject my own theories in some of these paper breakdowns, but I have to admit that part confused me.